There's a specific kind of silence that follows a conversation that never happened. Not the silence after conflict, not the silence after resolution. The silence that exists because the conversation itself was never initiated. I have been observing this pattern for some time. He does not storm out, he does not slam doors. He simply becomes unavailable in ways that are difficult to name precisely. He is in the room, he answers when spoken to, he continues to function in every measurable way, but something has withdrawn, and whatever withdrew, it left no visible trace of its departure. You may recognize this, not as something dramatic, as something ordinary, something that happens so naturally it barely registers as a decision. The question is not whether it happens, the question is what is actually occurring when it does. He is around 55, maybe 52. The exact number is not the point. What matters is the decade behind him and the specific weight that decade carries. He grew up in a household where emotional expression was either absent or unpredictable, not necessarily violent, not necessarily cold, but the architecture of the family did not include a reliable language for interior states. What you felt was your own business. What you showed was negotiable. What you said about what you felt was, in most cases, unnecessary. This is not a memory he revisits. It is simply the water he learned to swim in. By the time he reached his 20s, he had already developed a functional relationship with withdrawal. It worked. When something became too loud internally, he moved toward quiet externally. When a conversation began to press against something unresolved, he found reasons to be elsewhere. Not dishonestly, not with intention to harm, he simply moved toward what felt manageable and away from what did not. The behavior I am observing now is that same mechanism decades later. What makes it difficult to see clearly is that it has been refined. It no longer looks like avoidance. It presents as steadiness. He is not the man who shouts or breaks things. He is the man who stays calm. The culture he grew up in rewarded this. The workplaces he navigated rewarded this. The relationships he sustained required this, or so the structure of those relationships seemed to confirm over time. So when he pulls away now, it does not announce itself as withdrawal. It presents as reasonableness. I am just processing. I am not ready to talk. I need some space to think this through. These statements are not false, but they are also not complete. You may have said something similar. The words feel accurate when you say them. They describe something real. The question is what else they are describing that is not being named. I want to move carefully here because what I am tracking is not a personal failure. It is a structural pattern that emerged from a specific generational formation, and that formation has to be understood before the pattern can be seen clearly. He came of age in the late 70s and through the 80s. The cultural landscape of that era carried a very particular message about masculinity and emotional expression. Men who talked about their feelings were, at best, unusual. At worst, they were suspect.
The images he absorbed through media, through peer culture, through the observed behavior of adult men around him did not include models of men who named interior states and remained respected for doing so. This is not a complaint, it is a condition. The distinction matters. At the same time, the economic environment of his formative years was producing its own pressures. The restructuring of labor markets, the early signals of global competition, the beginning of the long erosion of stable employment, these were not abstract forces. They landed in households. They changed the emotional temperature of families. They created a specific kind of adult male anxiety that had nowhere sanctioned to go. What happened to that anxiety? It went somewhere. It did not disappear. Some of it went into work, into the relentless orientation toward productivity that became, for many men of his generation, the primary language of self-worth. Some of it went into silence, into the practiced capacity to hold internal pressure without allowing it visible expression. And some of it went into withdrawal, into the learned ability to exit the emotional field of a situation while remaining physically present within it. These three mechanisms, work, silence, withdrawal, became the architecture of a particular kind of masculine competence. They were adaptive, they functioned, they allowed him to survive environments that did not offer better tools. The problem is not that they worked then. The problem is that they are still the primary tools he reaches for 30 years later in situations those tools were never designed to address. When he pulls away instead of talking now, he is not making a conscious choice to be inaccessible. He is running a program that was installed early, that ran reliably for decades, and that his nervous system has never received a reason to uninstall. The behaviors themselves are not complicated to observe. He becomes quieter, he orients toward tasks, he finds projects that need doing. He spends more time in spaces that feel contained, the garage, the car, the particular corner of the house that functions as his low-pressure zone. His responses to questions become shorter, not hostile, shorter. The information he volunteers decreases, the distance between his interior state and what he communicates outward increases. And the thing is, he is not wrong that he needs space. That part is accurate. What he has never developed a reliable mechanism for is communicating what kind of space, for what purpose, and with what intended return. So the withdrawal happens, and the people around him are left to interpret it through whatever framework they have available, which is usually not the framework he would choose for them. This is where the habit becomes a structure, because over time, the people around him learn to read his withdrawal as a signal. They learn to approach him differently when he goes quiet. They learn to reduce their own demands on him during these periods. They learn to wait. And in learning to wait, they also learn, gradually, that waiting is what the relationship requires, that a certain emotional distance is not a temporary state, but a permanent feature. He has not asked for this, he has not designed it, but he has produced it reliably across enough time that it has now become the actual shape of his relationships. And here is what this does to identity. By the time a man has been practicing withdrawal for 30 years, it is no longer a behavior he performs, it is a behavior he is. He does not experience himself as someone who sometimes avoids emotional conversation. He experiences himself as someone who is simply not a person who makes a big deal out of things, someone who handles his interior life privately, someone who does not need to process out loud. This is not self-deception in a simple sense. It is something more complex. It is the result of a behavior pattern becoming so integrated into the self-concept that the original adaptive function of the behavior has become invisible. What began as a strategy for managing an environment that did not support emotional expression has become, over decades, a description of who he is. The cost of this is specific. It is not that he suffers dramatically, that is the wrong frame. The cost is structural. It appears in the particular quality of his relationships. In the things that do not get said between him and the people he is closest to. In the accumulated weight of conversations that were approached and then not completed. In the growing sense, which he may experience as vague dissatisfaction or as the specific numbness that comes from prolonged emotional containment, that something is present in his life that is also somehow not being inhabited. He continues to fulfill his responsibilities. He continues to show up. He continues to provide what the external structure of his relationships requires. But the interior of those relationships, the part that requires verbal exchange of interior states, that requires the kind of disclosure that feels like risk, that part has been quietly closed off for long enough that he has almost stopped noticing it is closed. This is the third layer. the layer where habit has become identity, and identity has become a kind of constraint that is no longer experienced as a constraint because it is experienced as simply being himself. But I want to go deeper, because underneath the identity question, there is a responsibility question that has not yet been named. He has spent the majority of his adult life being responsible for his income, for his household, for the people who depend on him, for the logistics and the finances and the maintenance of the structures that keep his life operational. This responsibility is real. It has required sustained effort. It has cost him things. And somewhere in the process of carrying this responsibility, he arrived at an unconscious conclusion that is worth examining carefully. That what he owes the people in his life is functional support, not emotional presence. That his job is to keep things running. That the internal work, the processing, the feeling, the naming of interior states is a luxury that his position does not include. This is not a belief he would articulate if asked. He might even disagree with it if it were stated directly to him. But his behavior over time reflects it with a consistency that makes it legible as an operating assumption. When he pulls away instead of talking, he is in part fulfilling this assumption. The conversation that is being avoided is not, in his implicit framework, part of what he owes. It is an additional demand, an escalation, a request for something he does not have the available bandwidth to provide. And so withdrawal in this context is not just emotional self-protection, it is also a form of resource management. He is managing what he experiences as a limited internal supply, the supply of whatever it is that difficult conversations require. And from a position of feeling already stretched across the responsibilities he carries, that supply feels genuinely unavailable. This is not a justification, it is a mechanism. The distinction, again, matters. The mechanism has a specific effect on his relationships. When he withdraws from emotional conversation, the people around him do not experience his resource management. They experience his absence. They experience the particular way his withdrawal feels from the outside, which is, in most cases, very different from how it feels on the inside. From the inside, it is self-protection. From the outside, it is frequently experienced as dismissal, as a message, however unintentional, that what is being raised does not merit engagement, that the person raising it does not have access to the part of him that would engage with it. Over time, this creates a relational structure that he did not intend and may not fully see. The people close to him learn which topics he will engage with and which he will not. They learn to calibrate what they bring to him. They learn to hold certain things back, not because he has asked them to, but because experience has taught them that bringing those things produces either a brief deflection or a withdrawal, and neither response is satisfying enough to justify the attempt repeatedly. So they stop attempting, and he, reading their behavior, confirms his own existing assumption that people are generally fine, that the relationship is essentially stable, that there is no outstanding conversation that needs to happen. Both conclusions are adoptive. Both conclusions are, in a specific and measurable way, incorrect. This is the fifth layer. The layer where identity built around responsibility has restructured the relational environment in ways that neither party fully names. And what that restructured environment produces over time is a particular kind of meaning. Not meaning in the philosophical sense, meaning in the practical sense. What a man considers worth his time and attention, what he still engages with genuine investment, what he still shows up for with something that resembles enthusiasm. For many men of his generation, by the time they have reached their mid-50s, the answers to those questions have narrowed significantly. Work, if it still holds structure, projects that produce visible results, relationships that are comfortable in their predictability, activities that do not require emotional negotiation. And here is what I observe. The narrowing itself is not distressing to him, or not primarily. What is distressing, when distress surfaces, is something harder to locate. a sense that the life he is living has become very efficient in ways that feel slightly wrong, that the absence of certain kinds of friction, the friction of real emotional exchange, the friction of being known by someone in a way that requires disclosure, has produced a smoothness that is also somehow empty. He does not usually name this directly. It surfaces in other ways. In the particular quality of his restlessness when weekends or the work is done, in the slight irritability that appears when social demands exceed what he has available, in the occasional, brief surfacing of something that might be longing, which he tends to redirect toward a task before it can be examined. The meaning question is not whether his life has meaning. It does, by most conventional measures. The question is whether the meaning is being inhabited or merely maintained. And the answer for a significant number of men in this generational cohort is that maintenance has become the dominant mode, that the life is being kept running by a man who has largely stopped asking whether the running itself is sufficient. Now, I want to name what this is at the deepest level, because what I have been describing is not an individual psychology, it is a generational structure. The pattern of withdrawal over conversation, the conversion of emotional avoidance into identity, the restructuring of relationships around the limits of emotional accessibility, the gradual narrowing of what feels worth engaging with. These are not the characteristics of a particular man. They are the characteristics of a particular cohort of men, formed in a particular historical window, under conditions that shaped them in specific and largely unexamined ways. The examination has not happened because the people inside the pattern are the people who would need to do the examining, and the pattern itself, its most sophisticated function, is to make the examination feel unnecessary. The man who has made a life of controlled withdrawal does not experience himself as someone who is missing something. He experiences himself as someone who has handled things, who has kept things together, who has done what was required. He is not wrong about that. He has done those things. The question that the pattern prevents from being asked is, at what cost and to what? This is the collective blind spot. Not ignorance, not failure. A structural feature of a generational formation that was built from the beginning without adequate language for its own interior. When I look at the full structure of what I have been tracing, the early formation, the adaptive withdrawal, the conversion of strategy into identity, the restructuring of relationships, the narrowing of meaning, the collective invisibility, what I see is not a problem to be solved. What I see is a system, a coherent, internally consistent system that has been operating for decades and that achieves reliably exactly what it was designed to achieve: the management of emotional exposure in an environment that did not make emotional exposure safe. That system is still running. The environment that produced it has changed considerably. The system has not received that update. He is not broken. He is not defective. He is the product of a specific adaptive process completed so thoroughly that the adaptation itself has become indistinguishable from personality. Every layer I have traced connects to every other layer. The early absence of emotional language produced the withdrawal behavior. The withdrawal behavior repeated across decades became a habit. The habit, sustained long enough, became identity. The identity, organized around responsibility and competence, restructured every relationship it touched. The restructured relationships produced a particular experience of meaning, or its partial absence. And all of it, running simultaneously in an entire generation of men, became so normalized within that generation that it stopped being visible as a pattern and started being experienced as simply how men are. You are looking at how men are. But you are also looking at something more specific, how a particular group of men became this way, under conditions that were not of their choosing, using tools that were available to them in a world that rewarded the outcome while remaining largely uninterested in the cost. The investigation does not end here. If withdrawal is what happens instead of talking, the question that follows is quieter and possibly more difficult. What would have had to have been different at the formation level for a different tool to have been available? What kind of environment produces a man who can stay in a difficult conversation rather than leaving it? And what does it mean that most of the men in this generation never lived in that environment? That question belongs to the next inquiry. For now, if something in what I have traced feels familiar, not as a judgment but as a recognition, I am interested in which layer produced that recognition. Leave it in the comments. The accumulation of those responses is itself a kind of data. If this investigation is useful to you, continue with the channel. There is more to trace, and the territory is not small.